Mr. Speaker, what is M-15? It's a non-binding motion brought forward by one of our new colleagues, a Liberal here in the House of Commons. Its purpose is to create a discussion and take a vote on a very specific proposal to make the donation of cash to conservation or preservation organizations be treated in the tax code the same as the donation of land. In the preamble of the motion, we read, "The Government of Canada has committed to conserving 30% of territory by 2030 in order to address biodiversity loss and strengthen the resilience of our ecosystems." Well, that sounds good, but here's the stumbling point. The House has never voted to approve the 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 agenda that Canada signed on to at COP15 on the Convention on Biodiversity. In the previous Parliament, the Minister of Environment, who has since resigned due to the MOU signed between Canada and Alberta, tried to table a bill to give the government a mechanism to implement the 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 agenda. The bill never passed and there was no vote. The government simply signed on and has begun implementation without consulting all Canadians or this House. The Liberals are doing so through the Fisheries Act powers, national park creation, and through agreements with First Nations called Indigenous Protected Conservation Areas. The government has already signed on to or has begun negotiations for over 60 of these Indigenous Protected Conservation Areas, and we don't know what's in them. I've asked for an access to information request, and I've only received 4 agreements that have been signed on by the government. I asked for these 2 years ago. They had 30 days to get back to me, and they haven't done so on over 50 of these agreements. So we are seeing a trend in Canada where the government and First Nations negotiate amongst themselves, and then announcements are dropped on the public, causing confusion, uncertainty, and now even the question of private property ownership in British Columbia is in doubt. So what is the agenda? For those of you that are listening at home, many of you have never heard of this. The Liberals' goal is to preserve 30% of the terrestrial and marine environments of Canada by the year 2030 and 50% by the year 2050. The rationale is to ensure habitat protection to maintain biological diversity. So it's not just a random 30% of Canada or 50% of Canada, it's 30% of each ecological zone in Canada. This means 30% of our mountainous areas, 30% of the Canadian Shield, 30% of prairie grasslands, 30% of the parkland forest, 30% of the boreal forest, and so on. Much of these areas have significant portions of the land as privately owned property. The government needs a mechanism to turn this privately owned land into recognizable conservation land or protected areas. Because the Convention on Biodiversity sets the standards of what it means to meet a conservation or preservation threshold, it will require private landowners to either sell their land or put easements or conservation overlays on that land, which would severely restrict what types of activities are allowed to happen on that private land. The mechanism to donate this land already exists. The motion seeks to make the donation of money to this cause be treated equally under Canadian tax law, which is meant to be a driver of this agenda. Furthermore, the government is using this non-binding motion to implement their global central banker-backed philosophy. The definition, for those of you that don't know how this works, for the 3030 initiative, a protected area is a geographically defined space managed legally or effectively to achieve long-term biodiversity conservation. This includes formal national and provincial parks, marine protected areas, Indigenous protected areas, and other effective area-based conservation measures, such as wildlife corridors or sustainable management zones. I want to focus on this for a minute because it is these other effective area-based conservation measures that this motion is specifically speaking to. This is largely how private land can become protected and count towards the 30% by 2030 and 50% by 2050. And there are excellent organizations in Canada doing good work. Ducks Unlimited uses a model of conservation easements where willing landowners are willing to put restrictive covenants on their properties in exchange for cash. These easements survive change in title so that when someone buys land with an easement on it, they honor the easement. Once these easements are in place, however, it does severely restrict what the landowner is allowed to do. For example, if you were going to do any development on that land, such as building a pipeline on it, the pipeline company would need both the blessing of the landowner and the holder of the conservation easement. You can see where this gets really complicated really fast. Furthermore, each easement is an individual agreement between the landowner and the holder of the easement. They're not all the same, so if you're managing a large construction project that's spanning several different easements, each one of them is written differently. The Nature Conservancy of Canada focuses more on purchasing land and will allow the continuation of farming and certain agricultural practices, but as the landholder and title holder, they would ultimately be able to decide if any other types of economic activity would be allowed to proceed on this conservation-designated land. Both organizations I know are well-intended. As a hunter, I appreciate that I can usually access these conservation areas, although it usually comes with more restrictions than accessing private land or Crown land. And who is driving and helping with this agenda? The United Nations. The Kunming Montreal Global A biodiversity framework adopted in December of 2022 establishes 4 goals and 23 targets for 2030 to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Core target includes 30 by 30, commitments to restore 30% of degraded ecosystems and halt human-induced species extinction. Financial reforms include reducing harmful subsidies by $500 billion annually and mobilizing $200 billion a year in biodiversity funding. Emphasis is placed on Indigenous rights, stewardship, and integration of traditional knowledge. This means that the Indigenous protected conservation areas will rely on traditional knowledge rather than science-based management of species, and this is in contravention, generally speaking, to the North American model of wildlife management, which creates confusion for wildlife managers. Targets to reduce pesticide risks, pollution, and cut food waste by 50% is another goal, and a framework for fair benefit sharing from digital sequence information, such as the genetic resources that we're looking to protect and preserve. The World Economic Forum, well, what role does the WEF have in this? It acts as a facilitator and coalition builder supporting the 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 agenda, aligns private sector capital and develops financial models, and brings political and business leaders together to advance the implementation of this agenda. The global financial sector and banking sector has a role in this as well. Banks are a key capital allocator supporting the 30 by 30 goal, estimated $1.2 trillion annually needed from the private sector investment in order to achieve their outcomes, addressing an estimated $700 billion annual biodiversity funding gap. Key roles for banks: mobilize private capital through blended finance and green bonds, shift portfolios away from nature-negative sectors, such as defunding oil and gas and other types of economic development, and develop new financial instruments, adopt a nature-related risk disclosure framework, and promote sustainable practices, which Canada already does in agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. So what would Conservatives do differently? I think Canadians would be surprised to know that currently 89% of Canada is Crown land, and 100% of our water is managed under the direction of the government. Nobody owns a single square inch of the surface of water in Canada. If the management of our Crown land has sustainable development frameworks underpinning it, and they do, and if the Government of Canada, who's responsible for all of our oceans, was properly managing them, then one could easily say that Canada has already met this conservation agenda. Nothing happens on Crown land without permission from either a provincial, territorial, or federal government. No activity is allowed to happen on the ocean without permission granted from the Government of Canada. No activity is allowed to happen on any lake or river without the consent of a province or territory. These are all governments that all Canadians are allowed to vote for. Now, for the remaining 11% of privately owned land, 7 of that 11% is zoned agricultural, meaning only agricultural activity is permitted on these lands. In fact, when it comes to listing the environment, farmers and ranchers are some of the best stewards of this land because it's in their own best interests to ensure the integrity of the land and the ecosystem. The land of a farmer is only valuable if it can continue to grow a crop, if it continues to yield forage or pasture for livestock, which means that this land is also very valuable for wildlife. Anybody with any hunting experience would know that pastoral land is some of the most prized hunting land a hunter can access. Marginal land with trees and natural systems acting as connecting corridors weaving through highly productive farmland and forage land creates an abundance of ungulates, migratory birds, upland game birds, and even some apex predators. That leaves 4% of the landmass of Canada available for building roads, cities, towns, and the human ecosystem. So why is land and building houses so expensive in Canada? Because we restrict access to our own land. 14 million people are only allowed to access about 4% of the land for purchase, building houses, and development. And now the government, through this motion, is enabling further restrictions on the 7% of farmland that is currently zoned agricultural. This will create more barriers to preventing economic activity that is necessary to keep our country working for all Canadians. Drawing circles and lines around 30% and eventually 50% of Canada and locking it in place for all time simply makes no sense. I'll give you an example. In its desire to help the southern resident killer whales on the west coast of Canada, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has created massive exclusion zones for fishing and other activities to help the whales. The whales are rarely in these areas because they are migratory creatures. Permanent closures and permanent restrictions have little to no use at all for the protection of these whales. While it serves the purpose of a box-checking exercise, it is very easy to question whether the desired result of balancing ecological integrity with economic activity is what the government is actually doing. They say they can protect the environment and protect the economy at the same time, but the results of their actions Conservatives say something completely different. Conservatives would gladly partner with organizations to aid in conservation and the recovery of endangered and at-risk species, with the understanding that if a necessary economic activity needs to happen, then everybody involved is consulted and that decision is made transparently. It is for these and a plethora of other examples that Conservatives cannot, in good faith, support the agenda that the government currently has, because we know that this agenda will overly restrict human activity, economic activity, and create friction in the socio-economic fabric of our country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.